Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back in an episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, I want to start with Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. I want to do a satirical post I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. Did anyone here watch State of the Union last night? And I said, I personally don't really care for the state of the propaganda, regardless of which Party figure out is in power. Maybe if Thomas Massey ever did one, but I don't think the people really running the show would let him make it that far into his presidency if he ever did manage to get elected POTUS. Look what happened to his last wife. She dropped dead under very mysterious circumstances. So, you definitely have to wonder about why. And then I said, Bill Maher, decent commentator by the admittedly very low standards of the legacy media, did a good segment on the show recently about why it's so bad. I think it needs to go back to just being Larry to Congress like it was from Jefferson to Taft. Thoughts. And yeah, if I wanted to see Donald Trump jerk himself off, I've seen that personally more than I would ever care to see anyone else jerk themselves off, for that matter. And that's very much what State of the Union is, just the president really just jerking himself off. I think social media and people constantly jerking themselves off on social media kind of made speeches like State of the Union kind of irrelevant. If people want to give an hour or 2 hour speech for whatever reason, they should be able to. But I definitely don't think there should be one scheduled every year, especially when it comes to essentially the president jerking himself off and talking about how great he is. If the president wants to do that, that's fine. But I think it's very much leads to this idea. Jefferson, like the State of the Union speech, because he thought it was similar to the English speech from the throne, or the British speech from the throne, I should say, or whatever. And that's very much how it's very much the president as a king, and that's increasingly the president is increasingly just a religion at this point, kind of a civil religion. I kind of blame Lincoln and how he kind of everyone kind of worships him, and I think that kind of leads to a lot of presidents just being worshipped as kind of and Lincoln's not the only fault. FDR, Ronald Reagan are kind of up there as well, and why people worship the presidency much. George Washington as well. I definitely do think the presidency should be more of an irrelevant institution than it currently is, but right now it's kind of all everyone talks about. There's a lot of Trump worshippers out there, but I say a lot of the Trump detractors, especially on Reddit, talk even more about Trump. They're just always Trump all the time, and it just gets tiresome after, especially no one can shut up about him for like a decade. And just because he's the president, it doesn't mean you have to talk about him 24/7, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have War is Peace, Freedom is Slavery, Ignorance is Strength, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-post from the Underreported News subreddit, which looks like it's since been removed by a moderator. And yeah, it looks like it says if you're looking for an image, it was probably deleted, so I guess we can only guess what that post was. That's very much how Reddit works at this point. It's constant censorship, and that's why I kind of have to do this podcast, because it's so censorship. I can't really say too much on Reddit anymore, so I have to say it on YouTube. And even if no one watches, I'm still going to say it. That's very much where we're at in regards to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, it's just constant censorship at this point. And I'm sure if Reddit had its way, anything deemed wrongthink by Reddit would be illegal, and I'd be sent to prison, and for just the slightest dissent at all from whatever their current narratives are. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have the new Trump tariffs are also unlawful from Cato.org, posted by BTheArt1, and they added more illegal tariffs. When does Congress step in? And personally, it doesn't really, as I said, I think the last episode, it doesn't really matter if the tariffs are legal or not. What matters is what the government's willing to enforce. What's written down on a piece of paper, which is what is technically the law, it doesn't really matter. It's just words on the piece of paper. What matters is what people are going to use the force of the state to justify. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Pentagon appeals order blocking Senator Mark Kelly's punishment for call to resist unlawful orders from APnews.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth should be impeached and removed from office. And yeah, personally, if the Pentagon wants to appeal the case against Mark Kelly saying, oh, you gotta resist unlawful orders, they should be able to. Ultimately, if they have the that's a lot of what life is. Life is who has the social and economic capital to do what, and the Pentagon has legal capital right now to do that. I'm sure that if it was a Republican senator saying resist unlawful orders under a Republican president, or Sorry, was there a Democrat senator, or no, was a Republican senator saying to resist unlawful orders under a Democrat president? Reddit would think it's the worst thing ever, and would say the Pentagon is more than justified. But since it's the other way around, Reddit only cares Republicans bad, Democrats good, and that's pretty much all how Reddit views politics. They vote for anything as long as it had D next to its name. They vote for a stick if it had D next to its name. And that's very much how Reddit works. It's very much the propaganda arm of the DNC. Next, we have annotated fact check of President Trump's State of the Union from NPR.org, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, I think if NPR wants to do a fact check of President Trump's State of the Union, I think that's fine. But NPR is kind of biased. I think it's interesting how Reddit treats Trump like he's this authoritarian dictator, yet NPR still exists, and NPR is a government agency. It's National Public Radio, and Trump might try and reduce funding to them, but just goes to show you that it was Reddit. It's interesting. Reddit says don't trust the government, but one of their favorite sources to use is NPR, and I just find that interesting. They'll believe whatever the government says as long as it has the correct narratives. And that just goes to show you can't trust NPR. It's government run propaganda. But of course, Reddit, they love government run propaganda when it just says whatever narratives they want to, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have FBI agents visited my home about an article I wrote, and now I can't go to Mexico, from thisweekinsecurity.com, posted by Patom13. That's crosswords from the Bad Cop No Donut subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think if FBI agents want to justify visiting anyone's house, ultimately they have the legal monopoly and least force to justify visiting whoever's house they feel like. And if they want to stop you from traveling to Mexico, the government has the force of the state to do that as well. And yeah, ultimately, it's not the government can justify doing whatever it wants to justify, because ultimately there's nothing you can really do about it. You guess you could say voting, but ultimately that's just going to bring a different wing of the authoritarians into power. And I would say they agree on like 95% of shit, and just use culture war issues like LGBTQ, immigration, and abortion to divide people to distract from that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration moves to allow intelligence agencies easier access to law enforcement files from ProPublica.org, posted by the Rare Right Rhino. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, if the intelligence agencies want to justify getting whatever files they want to justify, ultimately, they have the abilities to justify whatever they want to justify. It's very hard to fight against the intelligence agencies with how much entrenched power they have. Next, we have Trump's tariffs are not going to eliminate the income tax, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the Libertarian position is to eliminate the income tax and eliminate the tariffs. But ultimately, the government can justify enforcing whatever taxes or tariffs it wants to. And since they have the monopoly on the legal use of force and the control of the economic system and through the Federal Reserve, ultimately there's pretty much nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump administration repeatedly ways move to bar non-citizens from banks, from Axios.com, posted by Mundane Image 13. And and they added the fuck. This is just another example of government overreach. I doubt what actually happens. You can't do it by executive order, but there may be other avenues to attempt. Even then, though, I'm sure the banks would revolt, and I, for one, don't want to have the president even more paperwork to do normal daily activities. At this point, Trump just wants everyone to walk around with their papers at all times. Where have I seen that before? And yeah, personally, I think the Libertarian position is, as it's a private bank, that, it should be able to have whatever clientele it wishes, even if, it might not be the clientele I personally would like. If it's a public bank, I just probably shouldn't exist in the first place. But, I guess we do have the Federal Reserve, which is the state-run central bank, which I personally don't really care for at all. But, ultimately, I think the Libertarian position is, it's not. I don't really care for non-citizens holding money in the U.S., but, ultimately, the Libertarian position is, private banks should be able to have whatever clientele they wish. Next, we have what would the libertarian solution to intellectually what would be the libertarian solution to intellectual property theft from Ragnarok, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and they added Oliver Tree recently released a song called Jerk. Then this other artist, Southstar, basically took this whole thing, sped it up, renamed it Miss You, and called it a cover to avoid asking permission. Fast forward a bit, Oliver Tree releases a remix of his own song, and here it starts calling him the thief for stealing from the guy who originally sampled him. It's exactly like the old Glee versus Jonathan Colton mess. Glee used Colton's specific, unique arrangement of Baby Got Back, including his own lyrical tweaks, and didn't give him a cent to, or even a shout out. Fox's legal team basically argued it was a cover of a cover, so they didn't know the guy who actually did the creative work anything. A lot of libertarians argue that IP isn't real property because ideas aren't scarce, but then you have huge corporations like Fox or viral remixers basically strip mining the work of individual creators and giving nothing back. So without government intervention or contracts, how is one supposed to protect their work? And yeah, personally, I would say the libertarian position is be against intellectual property as a whole. I think if something's physical and you steal it, I think that's definitely a violation of the NAP. But if you put something out there like a song or a video game or a movie or something that can be posted online and spread through the internet, you're increasingly you're just giving it up to the people to do whatever they want with it. I personally wouldn't care if someone did edits of this podcast, but ultimately people are going to justify what they justify. If they want to make edits of whatever they want to make edits of, ultimately they can justify that, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.